This is the second part of a conversation that I had with Dr. Gabor Mate in Belgrade. Please do join us to hear more about what we spoke. So now that we understand what trauma is, what is our next step then, that we identified the cause of our behavior, of our pain, of the symptoms we're expressing? How do we actually heal, or where do we start our healing?
Well, I think we're talking about it on two levels. One is the social level of prevention, and then there's the individual level of healing. So I understand that, for example, the intention of the Đoković Foundation is to
prevent.
Yes. Now for that you have to educate parents.
Yeah.
Without blame, without pressure.
Yes.
But you ask a question. You want emotionally healthy children, loving children. Here are the conditions, and also means supporting families who are in trouble, who are at risk,
Yes.
There's a lot of parents out there who are like my wife and I. Were very loving, well-intentioned, but we didn't know ourselves well enough. We hadn't dealt with our own traumas. And if you don't deal with it, you pass it on to your kids. It's that simple. You can't help it. Not because you want to, not because you're not doing your best, but because your best is limited by how aware you are. So we need to make parents as aware as possible, as lovingly aware as possible of what the child needs. And so the Buddhist teacher, Thich Nhat Hanh, who died just about 2 years ago now, he said that the biggest gift a parent can give to his or her child is their own happiness. So parents need to take care of themselves emotionally. That's the first point, which will reduce the stress in the home. Then they need to learn about the needs of the child, such as you and I have been talking about. When kids go to daycare or preschool, they should not be just places of physical care. They need to be places of emotional nurturing. In other words, we can't go back to small band hunter-gatherer groups, but we can create a society in which every institution where children are looked after is a place of emotional support and emotional intelligence. So those daycare workers, now if you actually look at the development of the brain, I'm quoting from an article from Harvard University, it's a process that begins before birth and continues into adulthood. So then the question we have to ask in every institution that kids are looked after, the home, the family, the preschool, the daycare, the kindergarten, the school, until adulthood, they have to be places that don't just focus on the child's behavior or the child's skills, but on the child's emotional development, because that's the basis for everything. So these places have to be emotionally nurturing places. Schools have to be places of emotional nurturing. The daycare has to be a place of emotional nurturing, not just physical care. So that's the prevention part. When children show signs of trouble because of they're being aggressive or they're being oppositional or whatever, we need to recognize that not as a sign of some evil in the child that we have to force out of them, but as a sign of internal disturbance that's created by the environment. And we have to make sure that the child's relationship with nurturing adults remains strong and supportive. That's basically the prevention part. There was a terrible incident here in Serbia that was reported worldwide, I don't know, 5 months ago now, whenever it was. I don't know anything about that family. I can't talk about them specifically. But if I know anything, that kid was really hurting about something. The pain and the aggression and the rage that he felt, he wasn't born with it. It came from somewhere, And so we have done, these kids that are in trouble, that's an extreme example, but these kids that show signs of trouble, we have to see them, or if they have trouble paying attention. More and more kids have trouble paying attention these days. That was my first book.
Yeah.
There's nothing wrong with them. They're stressed. That's why they can't focus. So we have to look at their environment. So in other words, prevention is looking at the environment, like we said in the beginning, or if you're a gardener, if you're trying to grow plants, ask yourself, what are the conditions for the healthy development? The good news is about the human brain is that it can develop new circuits even later on in life. It's never over.
Brain grows by its use.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. So that begins before birth. So already emotional states of the pregnant woman have an impact on the brain development of the child. So we have to begin with the first prenatal visit about not just what's your weight and what's your blood pressure and what's your blood test, but also what are your emotional states like? How's your relationship with your spouse? How much stress are you under? So we have to, we have to look at the emotional side of human life. That's the prevention side.
Mm-hmm.
On the healing side, we have to understand that trauma is not what happened to you. Trauma is not that you were hit. Trauma is not that you were abused. Trauma is not that you weren't understood. Trauma is the wound that happened inside you as a result. So trauma is not the blow on the head. Trauma is the concussion. And that's good news. Because if trauma was what happened to me as a Jewish infant under the Nazis 79 years ago now, it's over. It's finished. It happened. It'll never not have happened. If trauma was that somebody was sexually abused when they were 5 years old by their grandfather, it happened. It'll never not have happened. But that's not the trauma. The trauma is the wound that I experienced. The trauma is the wound that that person experienced who was sexually abused. That can be healed at any time. So trauma is not in the past, it's in the present. So we have to look at how does the trauma that I experienced or somebody else experienced show up in our lives today. And that can be healed in the present moment. There's multiple ways of healing trauma, but if we recognize it, and if we see it not as something in the past, but as something in the present, then we can heal it, like you can heal any wound. So that's a simplified version, but the first thing is social and prevention. The second thing is individual. And, there's also healing on the collective level, but that's much more difficult.
I'm dying to ask you a question about how so many years after your personal trauma, how are you feeling it as a part of your life now? How did it evolve now into, because I know you're repeating your trauma from your childhood. Does that mean you're re-traumatizing yourself? Because sometimes if people talk about their traumas, are they reliving it again? Is that helpful? Is that not helpful? Because people tend to get away from talking about painful topics because it feels painful in them.
Yeah. I don't use the word re-traumatizing very much.
No?
No. If somebody was, to use a very stark, dramatic example, if somebody was sexually abused and then they get raped 10 years later, that's a re-traumatization, potentially. But if somebody was sexually abused and they talk about it 10 years later, that's not a re-traumatization. It's true they're going to feel pain, but as I said earlier, pain is not the same as trauma. Pain is trauma when you're alone with it and you don't know how to process it. Pain, when you can share it and talk about it and understand it, is healing. So sometimes pain is necessary for healing. You don't put somebody in pain deliberately, but here's the thing, the pain is already inside them. So let me tell you an interesting study about sexual abuse, for example. This is documented. A group of women who were sexually assaulted in their teens, and the assault was documented in hospital emergency ward records. So there was a medical record of him being sexually assaulted. In their 30s, they were asked about it. 40-50% of them did not remember that it happened to them, even though the medical record showed that it did happen. Now, why is that? that's because of the need of the organism not to feel the pain, so they suppress the memory. But as long as we suppress the memory, that pain is inside of us and governs our behavior. So when I was working with drug addicts, for example, why were they using drugs? Not to feel their pain. They had all been traumatized in childhood. In 12 years of work in what is North America's most concentrated area of drug use, in Vancouver's downtown east side, I didn't have a single female patient who had not been sexually abused as a child. To talk about that with them is not to re-traumatize it. It's to actually allow them to understand the pain that they're carrying, that they're escaping from through their drugs. So if we don't talk about it, if we don't allow people to experience the pain in a safe environment, they're just going to keep trying to run away from the pain.
So is it the goal to be comfortable with talking about it? Like, so that it, like, say, I've experienced bombing in my life, but I've spoken about it so many times that now it feels like I can't properly add the emotion I felt back then, because right now it's a matter of fact in my life.
So that could be, you could be right. Maybe you've healed it by talking about it. Or it could be that talking about it doesn't bring up the pain anymore, but there might be other situations in your life that triggers the pain and you're not even aware of it. And, you know, like you asked about me. So my wife and I have been married 54 years now. And sometimes it can still happen that something in a relationship will trigger the pain in me that goes back to 79 years ago. The difference is I recognize it now very quickly. Oh, this is not about the present moment, this is about the past. So it can still happen, but it doesn't have the power anymore to make me behave in certain ways that it used to have.
When I analyzed my experience, I felt like I was supported by my family in the moments of fear.
Were you?
I feel like I was, because I guess because I'm wearing pink shades, I remember the fun times of the bombing. I'm not allowing myself to remember things that were.
Well, it would take a bit of a conversation,
right?
But I don't. So I can't know what the truth of what you just said is. The fun things that you remember, they're not false. They're true. They happened. I'm sure you had many beautiful, loving, nurturing, nourishing experiences as a child. The question is, were there other experiences that you maybe haven't looked at as clearly? You know, so
For sure.
the looking at the pain doesn't invalidate the joy. They can both be there.
We are not allowed to think that way.
Yeah.
Apparently, when you speak about your childhood, you are just meant to remember the good times. And this is why it's so hard for therapists to work on the childhood experiences.
It's not that hard. But
you're not letting go of that. Like, because if you were to talk about things that were that happened in your childhood in a negative way, that would mean you are ungrateful. I remember when Oprah Winfrey in her, there was a stand-up talk where she did, and basically when Shefali was to speak to the crowds and say the way you were raised, especially with beatings, etc., was not okay. And there were so many Black Americans who were reacting in a way that was like, no, our parents did raise us well. And I mean, because it's the way they were raised, and they have to respect their parents. And so whatever they did it right. It was right because they loved us. And because
so
it's a conflict.
Human beings have a hard time with what's called integrative thinking. Integrative thinking is on the one hand, on the other hand. And I can hold both ideas and both emotions. So it's possible to love your parents and hate them at the same time. Not only is it possible, it happens all the time. But if you ignore and you deny the one, you're denying a part of yourself.
And in fact, I love that about children, because until they are 7, they cannot have those two emotions.
That's the whole point.
Yeah.
Integrative thinking is a developmental stage. And, you know, the 2-year-old, it's either I love you, mommy, or I hate you, mommy.
Yeah.
You know?
2 minutes later, they hate us.
Yeah, and that's just a way of saying that I feel anger right now. You know? So that most people are not capable of that.
Because they didn't develop properly?
They didn't develop properly, yeah. So it's like can you love your country but still be critical of what the government does? You know, like...
can you be part of your religion and still don't accept everything?
Can you be part of your religion but not like everything the church does?
Yes.
You know, for a lot of people they have a really hard time with that one.
Yeah,
you know,
because it's called betrayal.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's the myth of normal.
I mean, look, we're sitting here in Belgrade. I don't have to tell you the terrible history, remote and recent, of this part of the world. You know, when I say this part of the world, I don't just mean the former Yugoslavia, but also, you know, Hungary, Eastern Europe, Czechoslovakia, and you know, so many terrible things have happened here, and people have done so many terrible things to each other. You know, and everybody tends to be patriotic. Everybody's just victims of everybody else, but no, we didn't do anything to anybody. You know, that's childish thinking. The reality is, we've all done terrible things to each other, you know, and we've all suffered terrible things from each other as well, you know, and we have to be able to heal. We have to be able to look at that, you know, and that's a difficult process for a lot of people. You know, I mean, as a Jew, I grew up with, you know, I nearly died because I was Jewish as a baby, you know.
Wrong from the start, huh?
Right
That's
from
how they call it.
Yeah, right from the start.
No, they would say wrong from the start.
Wrong from the start, yeah, that's right. At the same time, at a certain point, I'm not trying to convince anybody of anything here, I'm just expressing a point of view. I became very aware that in the name of Jewish suffering, now we're making the Palestinians suffer. And we're still doing it. Well, you're not supposed to do that. As a Jew, you're not supposed to talk about the Palestinians.
Okay.
It's all about us being victims. I've seen the same thing in Hungary. Hungary right now, the history is presented as we're the victims of the Russians and we're victims of the Germans and we're just poor Hungary, little country. Poor little Hungary was an ally of Nazi Germany, and they attacked the Soviet Union. It played a role in its own devastation, but that's denied right now. We're just victims. Everybody, whether they're Serbs or Croats or Bosnian Muslims or Hungarians or Czechs or Slovaks or Russians or whoever they are, Americans, they just want to see themselves as victims. But to say that I actually participated in my own history and I have some responsibility, that's just so hard for people. That's just really hard for people. Genuinely hard for people.
So is it like we were thought to be victims because our parents were triggered by us? To go back to that, so they were the victims of us? Well, they just happened to react to us?
I think you're making a very good point. In other words, our sense of political victimhood is very often connected to our childhoods. So when we experience ourselves as victims as young kids, we will naturally see ourselves as victims in a political and historical sense. You know? So there's certain trigger words in Hungary. Mohács is a trigger word. Mohács is a battle in 1526 where the Turks came in and they destroyed the Hungarian army and they occupied, you know. Kosovo is a trigger word here in Serbia. What happened in the 13th century or the 14th century, you know?
It's still happening, so.
Yeah, and there's modern echoes and mirroring of that, you know? But we're far more likely to be triggered by what happened to us rather than what maybe we did to some others sometimes. You know, that's just, I'm not blaming anybody. That's how it works. In my marriage, I'm much easier for me to be a victim than to say, you know what, I helped to create this situation. I did something here, you know. No, that's not always true. Sometimes people suffer, not because they did anything, just because history. But certainly in personal relationships, and very often in international relationships, it's not just one thing or the other. It's usually more complicated. And people have a hard time with that. I think certainly in personal relationships, if I stayed a victim, my wife would have left me a long time ago. She won't put up with it anymore. And I'm quite capable of being the victim. Like even 2 days ago, I was a victim, in Glasgow. But I was only a victim for 5 minutes.
What were you the victim of? Circumstances.
Not being loved enough by my wife.
Oh.
But I made that up in my head because it fed into some old wound that I had, And she said, I'm not putting up with that. I said, okay. And she gave me 5 minutes.
Is that a timeout?
And basically, she gave me a timeout for 5 minutes. Literally, we're sitting in a museum, having a cafe, and she said, I'm going to go sit over there, and you have 5 minutes. 5 minutes later, I said, you know what, you're right. So I know how hard it is, but...
But maybe that's like what you were writing in your book about empathy, that sometimes we run out of the energy to feel empathy for others because we're tired of their repetition of their hurts, because sometimes, say somebody, unfortunately, like if you're very close with a person that was sexually abused or who had really big hurts in life, they will never really let go of that.
They can. They never go of it because they haven't had the right kind of help. And to the extent that they haven't let go of it, they're hurting themselves. But to let go of it, you have to have the right kind of support. Now, my wife is very empathetic. If I had said to her, I'm feeling down and depressed right now and kind of hopeless at that moment, which is what I was feeling 2 days ago, she would have been very empathetic. What she's not empathetic to is if I'm saying I'm feeling down and hopeless because of you, In other words, she says get over it. She doesn't mean to get over. If you feel down, I'm here to support you. But if you're telling me that I'm the cause of you feeling down, you got 5 minutes.
Do you rethink your strategy?
Rethink this one, Yeah.
That's amazing. I'm really happy to hear that. And that I told you we were going on the tour with your documentary, The Wisdom of Trauma.
Yeah.
And people were reacting differently. But for instance, in Montenegro, there were a lot of ladies asking me about the relationship between the man and woman, because how trauma shapes that relationship, and the childhood, how it shapes as well our expectations of our partners. Yeah. And of course, they were navigating me towards answering the question, because you are a very successful doctor, and you have a very successful career worldwide now, and more or less there is some kind of a similarity also with my husband and the relationship I have with him.
He makes a little bit more money than I do, but that's I'm not going to complain about that.
Potato, in fact, it doesn't matter about that. It's more like I'm about joking. Of course. I'm just trying to get out of that. In fact, it's like the time and the energy that you put into work, and then you come back home tired.
That's right.
And there is a certain stress in the family which you don't have emotional availability to.
That's right. That's right.
Because you have given yourself 100% to your job.
Yeah.
And you've received a lot of applause for that. And
That's
then
right.
you come back home and you feel, oh my God, now you have also needs. How about me?
That's right. That's a very typical dynamic between men and women.
Yes.
And I'll tell you something. I was just speaking in London to 2,100 people, and then in Glasgow to about 600 people. And and for about 15 minutes, my wife comes on stage. And she talks about how this played out between her and I. And how it played out is that I had my role in the world, and I'd be this successful doctor and writer and speaker, and everybody just, respect and support and love I get. And then I come home all tired and depleted, and then it's her fault. And it's her job to make me feel better, And so she comes on stage for 15 minutes and she talks about it. At the end of the day, I was on stage for 4 hours or 2 hours, and she was on stage on 15 minutes, And everybody comes up and says, the best part was the 15 minutes when you were... Because it's so common. And women have more autoimmune disease, like 80% of autoimmune disease happens to women. Rheumatoid arthritis, chronic fatigue, lupus, multiple sclerosis, colitis, Crohn's disease, eczema. I could go on and on and on. Fibromyalgia. 80% happens to women. And I say it's because women are programmed in this patriarchal culture to absorb the stresses of the men and to make themselves responsible. And so women have double the risk of PTSD, twice as likely to take antidepressants. What I've seen in family, in medical practice and all the literature as well, the reason this is happening is because women are absorbing the stresses of the men, and that's what's hurting their bodies. And
it's the part of motherhood that they can never shut down, right?
Well, it's a part of motherhood. The problem is, to talk about again my own history, when our kids were small, when we had 2 boys, before our daughter was born later, but we had 2 small boys. My wife had 3 children.
Including you.
Two of them were 1 and 4 years old, and the third one was 35 years old. And because men unconsciously, this is hard for men to hear, but I recognize it. Unconsciously, we're still looking for the women to be our mothers, which means that the mother now has some kids who are this small and a kid who is this big, and the energy that she puts towards being the mother to the big child is taken away from the small children. And it hurts the mother as well. It's too much. It fatigues the body, it stresses them. And that's why they get the autoimmune disease. So it's a serious problem. And that's why when my wife comes on stage and talks about it, she gets such a strong reaction because she's speaking to the experience of many women. And I don't know what the audiences will be like when we travel through these cities together, but very often a large percentage of the audience is women.
80%.
Yeah, because women are carrying the healing energy in this culture. And the men are just taking it for granted. And it needs to be 50-50. But it's very hard for men in this culture to admit that they have pain or that they have vulnerability, that they have, they just expect those needs to be automatically met. But they have a hard time actually admitting those needs and admitting their hurts, so that...
But being a man, they're not allowed to feel, to show their vulnerability, and
That's
this
right.
is in the culture quite strong. We discussed that over after we watched the panel. The documentary, and then we had a panel discussion where we actually touched that. In fact, I have a theory about it. Please do correct me if I'm wrong. I'm just thinking out loud. I feel like the mothers were not because when we were raised. I'm saying we, but I'm not sure I could be put in the same category as the mothers way back. Giving birth to a female child was considered like, because you have to support her until she, gets married. And if she's to get married, then you have to pay the dowry. And so she costs you. And if she's not pretty or if she doesn't have talents, then how are you going to sell her to another family? And if she's not, prospective mother, or... in a way, it puts burden on the family giving birth to a child that is female. And so she's wrong from the start. And she doesn't get the adequate love and attachment to any of the parents. And so the mother is raising the female child feeling like she's a failure for giving birth to a child that is female. And then that female child is meant to bring to this world another child and raise that child with love and care. And I told you about the book that Robin Grail wrote, The Parenting of the Peaceful World. And one question that I asked him was, how did we get out of such a vicious circle where who broke that Like, because it's such a spiral that keeps going and going and going, and where is the stop? Like, who becomes conscious of what we are doing?
Well, even today in India and other parts of the world, there's a much higher rate of abortions when the fetus is female.
Right.
So actually killing, not because the parents don't want a child, not because economic,
but because they're picking the gender.
They're picking the gender. So, so what you're describing is still very common.
Yeah.
In North America, the indigenous cultures were matriarchal. And it was the lines of power and transmission went through the female line. Mm. One of the first things that the colonialists did is to destroy that and to make it patriarchal. So this denial of the feminine and the devaluation of the feminine, it goes way, way back to the dawn of civilization. It wasn't like that in indigenous cultures. Again, we've gone far away from our true nature and our origins, and it began thousands of years ago. So already when you read the Greek tragedians, they talk about men as deficient. You know, and in ancient Greece, in Athens, there was democracy for the men, but the women couldn't vote. We're not even sure that women could go to the theater. And when female characters were presented in the plays, they were played by men in female costume.
Yeah.
So this goes way back to the beginnings of civilization, this denial of the feminine, and it's become much stronger over the centuries. You know, so and
hence this troubled relationship between men and women, because even from the mother side, they were never fed with enough love and gentleness so that they can feel similar towards their wives or even their kids.
That's right.
So
yeah, it's a huge problem.
Oh my God, that's so much to do. I have to say that when I was reading your book, The Myth of Normal, I was really like constantly going back to the index and looking like, okay, where is the healing part? I really need to get to the healing part, because everything you summed up pretty, you know, as it is. There is pretty much black and white right there, and you see it everywhere. And it's just that sometimes we are turning our heads towards, you know, in the other direction. So there are 4 A's for healing that I wish for you to kind of sum up for all of us to know where we're getting at. And then you also added another 2.
Yeah. So this is terrible because I'm always asking about the 4 A's that I wrote and I keep forgetting them. But
I did write them somewhere if you want me to.
Let me see if I can remember them. Okay. So in English they start with A's, you know.
Authenticity.
Authenticity is the first one, which is the reconnecting. Like one of the effects of trauma is to disconnect from ourselves. We talked about that earlier. So reconnection to ourselves, authenticity, knowing what we feel and being able to act on it. You know, now
checking in with ourselves.
Yeah, and exactly. And that may be a problem. Because if you're being authentic, as a child, you didn't have a choice in the matter. When you had to face being authentic, but as a result, losing your attachments, you had to give up the authenticity. You had to give up yourself. You had no choice. As adults, you might have the same problem. You might be in a relationship, and all of a sudden you decide to become authentic. Maybe your partner won't like that. Maybe they wanted the part that was always nice and pleasing and cooperative and never angry and so on. So now that you want to show up with your genuine emotions, they might not like that. And so that might threaten your attachment relationship. As a child, you had no choice. You couldn't choose authenticity. As an adult, you have a decision to make. If I can have both attachment and authenticity, if I can be myself in a relationship, that's great. But if I can't be, then what are you going to choose? So authenticity sometimes is a difficult choice, you know?
Then we have agency.
Yeah, no, agency is simply our capacity to make the decisions about our own life You know, so for example, we talked about childbirth. Is the woman going to be just swept along by what the doctors say? Or is she going to say, well, what do I want? What is my body telling me? How can I help? How can I get the help that I want? So agency is just, you know, when people get sick, I don't say don't listen to doctors. I'm a doctor. I think I got some useful things to say. But don't let me just take over. You decide, first of all, do you even like me? Do you trust me? Do you feel safe with me? Because if you don't...
That's also an instinct.
Yeah, and that might interfere with your healing. Mm-hmm. You know, so agency, who's making the decisions? You know,
anger.
Anger is essential. People that repress their healthy anger, they're more likely to get malignancy, they're more likely to get autoimmune disease. I don't know that I have time here to explain why. That's in The Myth of Normal. It's also in my book, When the Body Says No. But healthy anger is a boundary defense. It says, you're in my space, get out. That's what healthy... And once you've expressed it, it's finished. You don't get more and more enraged. You just get out. That's it. No, you're gone. The anger is gone. It's a boundary defense. Your immune system is a boundary defense. The job of the immune system is to let in what is healthy and nurturing, keep out what is dangerous. That's the job of your emotions as well. Now here's the thing that most doctors don't know, because they haven't studied the science. It's all one system. So the immune system is not separate from the emotional system. They're part and parcel of the same whole apparatus. They have some specialized functions, but they're part of one unit. Therefore, when you repress your healthy anger, you're also repressing your immune system. And now the immune system can turn against you. And if you look at people who develop autoimmune disease, 99% of the time they're very nice, they never get angry, they're pleasing people, they're always helping everybody else, not looking after themselves. You know? So we're not just talking about theory here, we're talking about practice. And people with autoimmune disease who learn to be authentic, they have a much better chance of healing. All kinds of examples of that. So anger, healthy anger. So there is authenticity.
Acceptance.
Okay, acceptance. Thank you. That's always the one I will forget, you know, which is really interesting, because I'm not somebody who accepts things very easily. No, acceptance is not tolerance. So acceptance doesn't mean that I put up with a bad situation. Acceptance means that I accept that it's a bad situation, that this is how it is. Now what can I do about it? So not resenting it for the way it is, not denying the way it is. You know, if I'm in a marriage that is painful, I need to accept that I'm in a marriage that's painful. That doesn't mean I'll put up with being in a marriage that's painful. It may mean that I go to work to find the source of the pain, and can we work on it together so we don't hurt each other anymore. But you have to accept that the pain is there before you go to work on it. So it's not the same as putting up with it. It's just, this is how it is. If I were to write it again, I would write a fifth A, which is like underneath all of these other five, which is awareness. And you mentioned that earlier, about being aware of what's in our body. So just awareness of what am I actually experiencing, what are my thoughts, instead of just reacting, being aware of what's happening inside me and choosing my responses rather than just reacting blindly. So for that, you need awareness.
That's part of your spiritual journey now.
That's part of the spiritual journey, and it's an old spiritual journey in all the religions. Yeah. There are some awareness practices.
And then you have the activism and advocacy.
Yeah.
As the two ways that you
added. We're social creatures, so that people did not evolve as individual, aggressive, selfish beings. We would not have evolved, we could not have survived in nature if it was everybody against everybody else. So actually we developed communally, where the welfare of the whole community was not different from your own welfare. And so activism simply means, or advocacy, simply means recognizing that oneness. So when you're engaged in the activities of the Đoković Foundation, you're not assuming that you're separate from everybody else in your society. You're assuming that there's a commonality that we all have. And so that working for the common good is meaningful. And that's what I mean by advocacy and activism. Now that, for some people, it may take the form of political activity.
It's like mostly like using your own healing journey to help others heal as well.
Yeah, and to advocate for conditions in which the same kind of traumas don't have to be reimposed on new generations. So that's what I mean by advocacy and activism.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm really looking forward to the journey with you through the region. I'm looking forward to awakening this topic. And I'm really grateful that we get to share this video of our conversation with as many people who are interested. So thank you for coming, and thank you for having this discussion with me, and let's go for a journey together.
But first, let's have lunch.
Why not?
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Yeah.